Hello, everyone. My name is Zachary Strong. I am a scholar, author, and I suppose I'm a philosopher. And today we're going to be talking about how to think like a true philosopher. So, if you're at all familiar with philosophy, you will know it's a discipline with many points of view and many books written and all sorts of, complexities and so on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify philosophy considerably and give you the tools that you need to conduct good philosophy for yourself and in your own life. So in this video, we're going to be looking at what is philosophy. Okay, we're going to answer that question. We're going to talk about the fundamental principles of philosophy. We're going to examine the conflict between ego and philosophy. I'm going to give you some practical examples, and I'm also going to give you some books to read. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much time, so let's just dive into what is philosophy. Now, for this explanation, I'm going to draw upon an address given to the West Point Academy by the philosopher known as Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand was a Russian-American philosopher active in the 1900s. Her philosophy, objectivism, became very popular because of books like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And in 1974, she was invited to speak to the West Point Military Academy about philosophy. And the beginning of her address, I think, is highly instructive when it comes to what philosophy is and what it's for. And so I figured I would just share that with you. Suppose that you are an astronaut whose spaceship gets out of control and crashes on an unknown planet. When you regain consciousness and find that you are not hurt badly, the first three questions in your mind would be, where am I? How can I discover it? And what should I do? You see unfamiliar vegetation outside, and there is air to breathe. The sunlight seems paler than you remember it and colder. You turn to look at the sky, but stop. You are struck by a sudden feeling. If you don't look, you won't have to know that you are perhaps too far from the earth and no return is possible. So long as you don't know it, you are free to believe what you wish. And you experience a foggy, pleasant, but somehow guilty kind of hope. You turn to your instruments. They may be damaged, you don't know how seriously. But you stop, struck by a sudden fear. How can you trust these instruments? How can you be sure that they won't mislead you? How can you know whether they will work in a different world? You turn away from the instruments. Now you begin to wonder why you have no desire to do anything. It seems so much safer just to wait for something to turn up somehow. It is better, you tell yourself, not to rock the spaceship. Far in the distance, you see some sort of living creatures approaching. You don't know whether they are human, but they walk on 2 feet. They, you decide, will tell you what to do. You are never heard from again. This is fantasy, you say? You would not act like that, and no astronaut ever would? Perhaps not. But this is the way most people live their lives here on Earth. Most people spend their days struggling to evade 3 questions, the answers to which underlie their every thought, feeling, and action, whether they are consciously aware of it or not. Where am I? How do I know it? What should I do? So in, this parable, Ayn Rand is outlining the fact that philosophy is a way of approaching the world and a way of thinking about the world. Okay? And really, when you get down to the essentials, philosophy is just thinking. Okay? It is a process by which your brain answers what is happening, how can I figure out what's happening, and what should I do? That's all philosophy really is. Okay? Philosophy is meant to help you develop an accurate and useful view of the world. Okay? It needs to be accurate so your brain understands what's going on correctly, and it needs to be useful in terms of directing action in the world. Okay? So you might hear people talk about, "Oh, my personal philosophy is this." Okay? And what they mean by that is, I see the world this way and I'm choosing to act this way. And, my personal philosophy is my series of reasons as to why I see things and do things a certain way. Okay, philosophy is just thinking. Okay, it's just thinking. Like, people, I think, make it out to be this lofty intellectual thing. Okay, but philosophy is really just thinking, and specifically learning how to think well. Okay, now I'm also going to add on to this using the famous example of Plato's cave, okay, which is another parable. And basically, in the parable of Plato's cave, you have these people trapped in a cave, and there's shadows being projected on the cave wall. Okay, and people are like, oh wow, look at the shadows. Like, I wonder what this shadow means. I wonder what that shadow means. Okay, and in this parable, philosophy is the mechanism by which people can realize that they are in a cave, find the entrance to the cave, or specifically the exit, and escape the cave and get into the real world. Okay, so philosophy is meant to help you realize what shadows you're being captivated by and how to get towards the light. Okay? Now, the problem is that a lot of people are satisfied with easy explanations or no explanations, which would be the shadows on the wall. People who use philosophy to understand what's going on are able to see past the shadows and reach the real world outside of the cave. And specifically, the willingness to think courageously is what allows people to engage in philosophy. Okay, so that's what philosophy is. Basically thinking, but also thinking courageously. Okay, becoming aware of the world that you're in, becoming aware that the easy answers are not always the best answers, and thinking through things so you can understand what is happening and what you should do. Okay? So I suppose in a single sentence, philosophy is the art of thinking accurately and usefully. Philosophy is the art of thinking accurately and usefully. Now you might be wondering, the title of the video is How to Think Like a True Philosopher. And, you're probably wondering like, okay, how do I do that? And that brings us to the fundamental principles. Okay, the fundamental principles. The first principle is objective reality. So also quoting Ayn Rand here, reality is an absolute. Existence is an absolute. A speck of dust is an absolute, and so is a human life. Whether you live or die is an absolute. Whether you have a piece of bread or not is an absolute. Whether you eat your bread or see it vanish into a looter's stomach is an absolute. Okay, and in my journey as a philosopher and author and so on, I've actually spoken to people who tell me with full sincerity that they don't think anything is real outside of their own minds. Okay, I've talked to people who think that, like, the real world, like, it's not really real, whatever, right? And then I ask them, are you willing to stop eating? Are you willing to just stop eating? Because if the world isn't real, then food isn't real, and why would you bother eating? Right? And of course, they don't like that very much because it exposes an obvious contradiction between what they say they believe and what they actually believe. Okay? Anyone who is not willing to engage in objective reality, okay, or they take that position, I just challenge them to stop eating. Okay, and of course, that exposes the contradiction. Now, the second principle of philosophy, which I would consider fundamental, is the essence of knowledge. And this sits at the root of both Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. Okay, in terms of Western philosophy, Socrates said, I am wiser than this man, for neither of us appears to know anything great and good. But he fancies he knows something, although he knows nothing. Whereas I, as I do not know anything, so I do not fancy I do. And then Confucius said something very similar, within about 100 years of Socrates. When you know a thing, to hold that you know it, and when you do not know a thing, to allow that you do not know it. This is knowledge. Okay, so this insight sits at the bottom of both Western and Eastern philosophy. And basically what both Socrates and Confucius are saying is if you know something, you know it. If you don't know something, you don't know it. Okay? And you have to admit that you don't know it. Okay? That's the whole principle. That's the essence of knowledge, is knowing what you know and admitting what you don't know. Okay? And this is a fundamental principle in philosophy. Okay? The third principle is the law of non-contradiction. And again, I'm drawing on Ayn Rand here. A contradiction cannot exist. An atom is itself, and so is the universe. Neither can contradict its own identity, nor can a part contradict the whole. No concept man forms is valid unless he integrates it without contradiction into the total sum of his knowledge. To arrive at a contradiction is to confess an error in one's thinking. To maintain a contradiction is to abdicate one's mind and to evict oneself from the realm of reality. Okay, and what Ayn Rand is saying here is that contradictions can't exist. Okay, if A and B are mutually exclusive, okay, if A being true means that B is false and B being true means that A is false, they're mutually exclusive, then you can't really have A and B. Okay, it's either A or it's either B. Or in some cases, both A and B are true, but there is a deeper insight or a deeper truth that is uncovered through the paradox and the contradiction. Okay, but in general, contradictions don't exist. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the practical examples, but the law of non-contradiction is very, very important in philosophy. You do not want to be holding contradictions in your mind. You want your thinking, your worldview, and your actions to be coherent. Okay, you want them to make sense. And when you have contradictions or you entertain contradictions, things don't make sense and you run into trouble. Now, finally, we're going to look at something that Friedrich Nietzsche said, which is what I call an appeal to reality. And this is the fourth fundamental principle. Nietzsche said that we must become the best learners and discoverers of everything that is lawful and necessary in the world. We must become physicists. While hitherto all valuations and ideals have been based on ignorance of physics or were constructed so as to contradict it. Therefore, long live physics, and even more so that which compels us to turn to physics, our honesty. Okay, and what Friedrich Nietzsche is saying here is that the scientific knowledge that we have accumulated, okay, the scientific knowledge that we've accumulated over the last few hundred years, it enables us to do philosophy. Okay, because if we're trying to figure out what is happening and what should we do about it, then scientific laws and the laws of physics and scientific discoveries help us answer the first question, which is, what is happening? Okay, so the fourth principle of philosophy that I would, suggest to you is that if you want to do philosophy, you probably need to master science or at least be well acquainted with scientific discoveries. Okay, because it's kind of hard to figure out what reality is when you don't know anything about reality, right? And science is how we've been investigating reality. Okay, so to summarize, first principle, there is an objective reality which can be discovered. The second principle, you must admit when you don't know something. The third principle is that contradictions must be resolved. And the fourth principle is that science and other forms of investigation are tools for philosophers. Okay? With these four principles, you will be able to do philosophy. Okay? And to be honest, a lot of people who call themselves philosophers, a lot of people who call themselves intellectuals or whatever, do not follow these principles consistently. Okay? A lot of people, as I've discovered in my travels throughout the world, they do not follow these principles consistently. Okay? I have spoken to many, like maybe not many people, but I've spoken to a few people that are unwilling to admit there is an objective reality. Okay, and some of those people are therapists. Okay, imagine talking to someone who's in charge of other people's mental health and they are not able to admit that objective reality exists. Okay, it's scary. It's genuinely scary. Okay, so the first principle, there's an objective reality. I've also spoken to many, many people who are unwilling to admit that they don't know something for sure. Okay, very often, a lot of philosophical debates I've been in, I realize that I'm talking to people who want something to be true. Okay, they want something to be true, so they argue for it. Instead of saying, I want to figure out what is true, they've already decided what they want to be true and they're just arguing that. Okay? I've encountered many, many people who are strangely comfortable with contradictions. Okay? And usually, when I talk to these people, eventually they get to a point of, well, I don't know, whatever. I don't know, whatever. Which is basically them saying, I don't care about contradictions. I don't want to put in the mental effort to resolve the contradictions. Just leave me alone and let me collect dopamine. Okay, so I've spoken to many people there. And then when it comes to science, there's a lot of people in philosophy departments in universities who are not scientists, who are not well versed in science, you know? And so, unfortunately, when you look at these four principles, okay, a lot of people, especially so called professional philosophers, they don't follow these. They don't follow these, which is one of the reasons why our world is such a mess right now. Okay, so these four principles, if you want to be a true philosopher, you must follow them consistently. And by consistently, I mean all the time. So this brings us to the problem of ego versus philosophy. Ego versus philosophy. So as I've already mentioned, philosophy is not, how can I justify to others what I want to be true? That is called sophistry, okay? Also known as nonsense. Okay? Philosophy is not justifying what you want to be true. Philosophy is, how can I discover what is true regardless of my preferences and wishes? Okay? That is what philosophy is. It is a commitment to the truth. Okay? It is accepting that there's an objective reality. It is admitting that maybe you don't know what's going on. It is being honest about contradictions and resolving them. And it is also being honest enough to look at science and other discoveries and so on to help answer the question of what is going on. Okay, philosophy is fundamentally the question, how can I discover what is true regardless of my preferences and wishes? Okay, and unfortunately, humans are ego-driven creatures, okay? And far too often people have ideas in their mind about what they want to be true, and they'll just spend an entire lifetime doing fake philosophy to justify what they want to be true. Okay, instead of submitting themselves to the concept of reality. Okay, so this brings us to some practical examples. Okay, some practical examples. The first example I'll use is the completely hypothetical idea of a new medicine. Okay, so here's the situation. Let's say I invent a new medicine from scratch in 6 months. This medicine has not been tested thoroughly, and the long-term effects of the medicine are unknown. However, I tell you that it is safe and effective and that you should take it. Okay, so this breaks the second principle of philosophy, which is admitting what I don't know. Okay, because if I'm inventing a brand new medicine and I don't know the long-term effects of it, I don't actually know if it's safe long-term, and I cannot logically make that promise to you. Okay? Okay, and so as you might imagine, North America and Europe particularly broke one of the fundamental principles of philosophy quite aggressively. Quite aggressively. Okay? And everyone seems to be okay with it. Well, not everyone, but most people seem to be perfectly okay with it. Okay? It's mind-blowing to me. It's genuinely mind-blowing. Okay, so the second example is personal claims. So let's imagine that I tell you that I am a black woman. Now this breaks the third fundamental principle of philosophy, because I am clearly a white male, and me trying to tell you that I'm a black woman is an obvious contradiction. The contradiction cannot exist. Okay? So that's the second example. The third example is the philosophical tangent known as postmodernism. So what if I tell you that reality is socially constructed, which many postmodernists have tried to do for decades? Okay? This breaks rule number one, because the food in your fridge is not a social construction. Whether you live or die is not a social construction. Your monthly rent or mortgage is not a social construction. Okay, so if I try to tell you that all of reality is socially constructed, it just doesn't make sense. And it also kind of breaks rule number three, which is, a cheeseburger is not a social construction. A cheeseburger is a cheeseburger. It is a source of food and, in my opinion, nourishment. Okay, so if I point to a cheeseburger and I tell you that it's just a social construction, it makes literally no sense. It makes literally no sense. Postmodernism, in all fairness, postmodernism has some value in terms of everyone has a different perspective on reality, and we need to enjoy those perspectives. But the fact is that there is an objective reality on which we are all taking perspective. Okay, and unfortunately, I've spoken to therapists, university professors, other professionals, and, just armchair philosophers like myself. A lot of people are unwilling to admit that there is an objective reality. To them, everything is just an opinion. And it's like, the food in your fridge is not an opinion. Okay, it's not an opinion. So the final example that I'll use, which is kind of shocking, is known as abiogenesis, which is the belief that all life began with some chemicals in a puddle. Okay, so let's think about this. Your science teacher tells you with certainty that all life began with chemicals in a puddle. However, scientists have never replicated abiogenesis in perfect laboratory conditions, and they also cannot explain the thermodynamic mechanisms that made this possible. Okay, so this actually breaks rule number 2 and number 4. Life as a process seems to defy entropy, okay, which has been outlined by luminaries like Erwin Schrödinger and modern neuroscientist Carl Friston. Okay, so life as a process seems to defy entropy. Okay, and no one can really explain how the process of life began from inanimate matter and chemicals. Okay, and we have also never replicated this, and replication is key in science. No scientist has ever created new life from inert matter. And therefore, abiogenesis, and therefore part of the theory of evolution, it's just a theory and it's not a provable fact. No one has ever been able to prove that life can be made from chemicals. They assume it's true. They want it to be true. They hope it's true, but they can't prove it. They can't prove it. Okay, it's never been replicated. The physics of such a thing are so improbable that we should still be waiting for it to happen in the universe. Okay, the physics of it are so improbable, we should still be waiting for it to happen. It's nearly impossible. It's never been done in a lab. They can't replicate it, they can't prove it, but they teach it as fact in science class. Okay, and that's breaking a couple of the rules of philosophy. Okay? And so that's mostly what I wanted to share. That's mostly what I wanted to share. Um, again, the four fundamental principles of philosophy are: there is an objective reality which can be discovered. You must admit when you don't know something. Contradictions must be resolved. And science and investigation are tools for philosophers. If you stick to those four rules, okay, and you are honest with yourself and you purge your mind of all sorts of contradictions and so on, okay, you will be among the most talented philosophers ever to walk the earth. Okay? These four principles, okay, will turn you into a Socrates. These four principles will turn you into a Nietzsche. Okay? But you must follow these four principles at all times. At all times. Okay? So when it comes to books to read, okay, if you want to improve your philosophical chops, I suppose you could say, what books can you read? The first book I would suggest is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Okay? This book, it's a storybook. It tells a story. But I think you will very quickly see that when she wrote it back in, I think, the 60s and 70s, she was basically predicting what would be happening over the last decade or so. Okay, so this book in some ways is like prophecy. And she outlines in that book her philosophy of objectivism, and she uses the story as a mechanism to demonstrate why her philosophy is valuable and useful. And it's a good story. Atlas Shrugged is a good book, objectively. It's a good fiction book. And it's also full of really good philosophy. So I would recommend that. Another book I would recommend is Consilience by Edward O. Wilson. So this book is a nonfiction book about the unity of human knowledge. It's about harmonizing the humanities and science. Okay? And so it's a book basically on scientific philosophy. And I consider this an extremely useful work. It's very, very interesting. And it'll help you understand kind of how different sections of human knowledge can all fit together. Okay, so those are the two books I would recommend by other authors. Now, the third book I would recommend has a link in the description, and that is my book called Ticket to Heaven: Towards the Unity of Knowledge, the Destruction of Idols, the Reclamation of Western Thought, the Realization of the American Dream, the Final Answer to the Jewish Question, and Utopia. So this is a book that I produced after 8 years of research, after 8 years of following the four fundamental principles that I outlined to you. I came up with a book that has 1,000 references. I think it's actually got like 1,007 references. And I've also included 100 cultural artifacts. So in the book, there's also quotes and so on. And I also layered on a bit of art in this work. Okay? And in this work, I cover current events, I cover philosophy, I cover psychology, neuroscience, physics, sociology, education theory, aesthetics, and theology. Okay, this book is essentially an attempt at a theory of everything. And based on the feedback I've got from people who've read it, they like it. Okay, so the book is available for like $30 on Amazon, something like that. Links in description. So if you want to see what following these four rules can do for you, check out Ticket to Heaven. Okay? So anyway, thank you very much. I hope you found this video helpful and useful. The rest of my channel has a whole bunch of things that, come from, me following these fundamental principles. And, you can do the investigations on your own, of course, but I hope, my videos and my channel and, my book, I hope, and I think these will save you a lot of time. Okay, so you don't have to do research for 8 years. Okay, you don't have to do research for 8 years. You can just spend 3 weeks and read this book. Okay, and you'll be able to benefit from my 8 years of research in about 3 weeks' time, which I think is a pretty good deal. So anyway, thank you very much again. Like and share and subscribe, and hope to see you back on my channel soon.